Hello everyone and welcome to the studio. It's time for another pastel painting demonstration, and today what I want to share with you is something that it's helpful for beginners, but it's also helpful for those of you who have been painting a while and we tend to forget the basics, and that is how to get the paintings to really pop. What do you do at the end of a painting to really pull out the details and really make it come to life or make it sing? And I want to share that with you today in my demo, and I want to show you the tools that I'm going to be using first, and then we'll get started. So come a little bit closer and I'll show you what I'm going to be using in today's demo. First I'll show you the paper I'm using is LuxeArchival sanded paper. It was white paper, and I actually already did an underpainting. This was for a previous demo, and I did not have time to do the finished painting. So I actually used these Derwent Inktense blocks, which are really basically sticks of ink, and water to create a wet wash underpainting. So I'm going to be using this underpainting as the base for the pastel painting. But I want to share with you the pastels that I'm going to be using, and this is where I meant about going back to basics. Pastel 101 tells us that there are different hardness levels of pastels depending on how much pigment versus binder are in the makeup of those pastels. So I'm going to begin with harder pastels. These happen to be Nupastels brand. These are harder because they have more binder and less pigment. And I can start a painting with them and not fill the tooth of the paper as quickly. But then after I do use those, I'm going to move into my softer pastels. This is Terry Ludwig pastels. These are my favorite pastels. This is the Floral landscape set. This is a set that I curated for Terry Ludwig. It's good for all landscapes, but especially nice for landscapes with flowers, which is what we have today. But now here's the real well, I don't know that I would call it a secret, but this is something that we oftentimes overlook or forget. These are fantastic pastels. I love them, but how do I really get my painting to sing at the end? Well, lately what I've been doing is going to an even softer pastel for those finishing marks. And this is the set of 120 Sennelier half stick. This is the Paris collection. Look at these beautiful vibrant colors, and these have more pigment and less binder, so they're super soft, which means they make a really nice thick creamy mark, which are perfect for those finishing marks. So I'm going to go from harder to softer and gradually build up the level of detail, and that's what's going to help me finish this painting so that it really sings at the end. So let's get started. Before we get started with the demo, I really want to ask you a favor. If you wouldn't mind liking and commenting and hitting that notification bell. I know you hear it before on every YouTube channel, but it really does help us grow our channels, and I really want to keep providing this quality content for you, and your support and your interaction with me really helps. If you want even more, if you want to be an insider, join us over on Patreon. I have had a Patreon group for the last, I think we're coming up on 4 years in September. There are almost 400 videos that are exclusive to Patreon. So if you're already there, I really appreciate your support. If you want more video, more lessons, more in-depth pastel instruction, join us, become a pastel insider over on Patreon. All right, now back to the demo. All right, here we are. I want to show you my reference photo, some Queen Anne's lace, and my 4-value thumbnail sketch that I made because I'm changing the orientation of the painting from portrait mode to landscape mode, so I did a thumbnail so that would help me out. I've eliminated a lot of the clutter, and what I just want to do is focus in on those flowers. I started with a colorful underpainting. I called all this down here the dirt because I know I'm going to have a lot of green on top of it. I want the green to be interesting, so I put some warm colors, some dark colors over in this section, so that will help kind of make the greens a little bit more exciting. So the first thing I'm going to do is reinforce those dark areas with the hard pastel. So I'm going to start with a dark blue, Nupastel, and wherever I have dark shapes, I'm going to just very lightly add some of this dark blue. Now, you might be wondering, why am I making it dark in this area? And I call this a foundation pathway. It's there to help hold these flowers in place, to help them kind of like hold their roots. Otherwise, they're going to look like they're floating. Flowers are floating, and we don't want that. I'm also darkening the very base of some of these taller flowers. So that's one layer of dark. The other, I think I'm going to add one more layer. I'm going to take a dark red and very lightly go over the dark blue. I just want to make it more complex and more interesting. How do I know if I'm using a light enough touch? Well, if I can see the colors of the underpainting underneath, then I know that I have a light enough touch. If not, if it's too solid, like it actually in this area is a little too solid, then I know I need to lighten up my touch. I want to continue with these softer pastels. I'm going to move, that was all the dark areas. I want to move into the lighter areas, which happens to be our blue sky. So I'm going to take the hard pastel and very lightly adding a layer of pastel to the underpainting. I want to use a very light touch because I really like the painterly quality of the underpainting. I don't want to necessarily cover it all up with thick, heavy pastels. Now, one thing that I'm starting to do is taking that blue sky color and working it down into the darker areas or the grassy areas, just so that I can have a little bit more, I don't want the sky to look like it's just cut off. I want it to feel a little more natural. So I'll bring a little bit of that sky color down into the grass. Alright. Let's add a little bit of a warmer blue at the horizon. Give a little variety to our sky. Alright, so we have our darks, our lights. Now what I like to do is put in the most intense color sometimes, and that I know is going to be that really bright grassy green, that warm, whoa, jumped out of my hand, that warm sunlit green that I see in those distant grasses. So I'll just add some of that with the hard pastel, and then I want to go ahead and make sure there's a layer of pastel everywhere before I move on to my softer pastel. So I'm going to come in with a little bit of a reddish brown into my dirt area. And I need to add some color to our flowers. And some of the flowers are getting a little bit of shadow. The sun is really coming, they're actually backlit, which is tricky. So I'm going to make an executive decision and say that the light is coming, the sunlight is now coming more from the left side. So I'll illuminate more the left side of the flowers and put the right side more into shadow, rather than trying to paint them as completely backlit. And yes, I'm allowed to do that because I have an artistic license. We don't have to copy exactly what we see in our reference photo, unless we're trying to do something that's photorealistic, and in this case I'm not really. So I have permission, or I have the freedom to make changes to make my painting either more interesting or just kind of to suit what I'm trying to do. Now what I just did was added a very pale pink, but I see there's a lot of kind of sunlight glow in these flowers, so I'm going to actually go ahead and add some yellow to these flowers. I have something that I call the 1-inch rule when I'm painting things that are very light, like flowers or clouds, and that is, if they're going to be larger than an inch on my painting, take up more room than an inch, then I'm going to leave room for them in the underpainting stage. So you notice that you could see the flower shapes before I started this. I actually left room for them. If they're going to be smaller than an inch, like tiny or maybe hidden, I'm going to add a few more flowers that I'm going to hide behind some of the foliage. Smaller than an inch, then I know I can paint over the layers of pastel, and I will not necessarily leave room for them. But these larger ones, I definitely left room. All right, I've now completely covered the painting with hard pastel. Very light layer, so I still have a lot of tooth left on the paper. I still have a lot more ability to add more layers. So I'm going to move on to the softer pastels. These are the Terry Ludwig pastels. And I'm basically going to do the same thing, only I'm going to add a few more colors. I want to still keep it a limited palette. I don't want to go too crazy with color. But I'm basically going to repeat those same steps. So I'm going to come in with a softer version of a dark blue, which is what I started with to begin the layering process. But now, because these are softer, I have to really pay attention to my touch, to the pressure that I use to apply the pastel. And I'm pulling the dark out just a little bit further. And I really want to add a little bit more darkening underneath these main flowers. And one thing that I do want to stress is that I want a variety in my darks, but I don't want it to look like a dark sidewalk or pavement, so I don't want it to be solid. I want you to be able to still see the interesting colors that are underneath. I think that's going to be enough dark. What I just took out was a dark burgundy. Now, you might be asking, if you're familiar with Terry Ludwig pastels, you might be saying, what about that dark eggplant that I use a lot or that I hear about? Why aren't you using that in the dark areas? And I am right now. You can see in this area I just put in that dark V100 eggplant, and I like to use it for accents. Like, I don't want it everywhere, because if it's everywhere it will lose its impact. So I've added just a little bit to kind of accentuate some of the larger flowers, and that will help them pop. But if I use the dark everywhere, then it really doesn't have as much impact. Now, I don't want my flowers to be floating on top of the foliage, and right now you can see they're all going to be on top of the foliage, but we will fix that as we continue on with the painting. All right, so I've added the dark with the softer pastel. Now I'm going to take an intermediate step, and I'm going to take some workable fixative, and I'm using Blair very low odor workable fixative. I've also experimented with spraying alcohol, and it's actually worked quite well. So if you don't have this, try giving that a go. And I'm just spraying those dark areas with the workable fixative. The reason why is I really want those darks to remain in place, and I want to start to build layers of greenery, greens and oranges and grass colors. But I want the darks to really stay nice and dark. So I've sprayed them just to kind of preserve them a little bit more. And now I'm going in with some dark value greens. And I really like the underpainting colors of those warmer oranges and yellows. And I think that really helps give a nice feeling of that mix of grass. You know, usually we don't just have all green grass. There's always going to be some dried bits and some other kind of things growing in there. So a little variety will make the greens much more interesting, and will also be more natural feeling. So I'm going to add another layer of green. This green is slightly lighter than the one I just added, so I'm gradually getting lighter. Here's a nice, I call this my grass green. When I see grass, or when I want to paint grass, this is kind of what I think of when nice grass green, middle value. green for that. Now, one thing that I really enjoyed about the reference photo is there was this really nice glow in the distant grasses. They were really nicely lit by the sun. So I want to kind of capture this in my grass, and it's interesting because what I'm actually trying to do is build from the back to the front. So I'm painting what's in the distance and what's underneath, and I will get to the important flowers, but I have to kind of lay the foundation first. Now here I'm coming in with a really nice bright yellow green, and I'm using a super light touch because again, these are softer pastels, so they're releasing more pigment. So I really want to be sure that I don't press too hard and cover up all the work that I've just done with the harder layers. But I want to really add that really nice bright sunlit green, and I'm going to very lightly work it down into the darks because the sunlight is filtering into these darker areas. So super light touch. And I have another yellowy green. This is a little bit darker, but it's got a similar warmth to it. All right, where are we so far? We've reinforced the dark areas, we've added some interesting colors to the grasses, and now let's go back to address the sky with softer pastels. So we already have some really nice blues in play from the underpainting. So technically, the underpainting is working really well, and I don't really have to add a lot of pastel to it. But what I want to do is kind of get my sky to look a little more natural and really kind of have a nice, believable airiness to it. So I just added a very, very light, let me hold it up, it's a blue. I love this color. This is a kind of very, very light value periwinkle blue, purplish blue. And when we mix it with the sky blue that was already there, it really makes it feel a little more airy. Now I'm adding a light, warmer blue. It's a little bit lighter value, because I know that the sky is going to get a little bit lighter as it comes closer to the horizon. Now remember what I did with those harder pastels in the very first layer? I'm doing the same thing with the soft pastel. I'm working it down into the grass just to give a little bit more variety and start to negatively paint some of these grasses. So one thing we can do is we can paint actual blades of grass, but another thing we can do is kind of work the background color into the grasses just to kind of pull out some grass shapes. So I'm going to just, I don't really want it to be cut off all across the middle, so I'm keeping that in mind as I add some sky down into the flowers. Just give it a little less evenness. All right. So now we've got our sky in place. Now let's turn our attention finally to those flowers. You might be thinking, wow, it took you a long time to get to those flowers. And it's kind of a little bit frustrating sometimes because they're there and they're screaming for attention, and you know you want to paint them. But you also know that you need to build the foundation, lay the foundation before you can come in and finish them. So I'm taking this wonderful gray down violet, and I'm making I added some of the gray violet to the shadowed portions of the larger flowers. But also one of the things that I did was I added a few kind of blocky shapes, and these are going to be the illusion of some of these flowers kind of in the distance. And I don't actually see that in my photo right here, but I know that when you're standing in a field that is loaded with flowers, there's possibility that there's some in the distance. So adding a duller, now I'm adding a blue-gray, but adding some of these duller colors kind of helps promote this idea of flowers in the distance. All right, so now we've got the shadows in place. Let's go ahead and add a little bit more color. And basically I'm repeating what I did with the hard pastel. You might be saying, well, why didn't you just paint the whole painting with those hard pastels? And guess what? You can. And I have. But as you will see, you really can't get the quality of marks that I'm able to get with the softer pastel. Especially when I start to add them in a with more pressure. I'm going to start to, right now, up until this point, I've been what I like to say whispering the pastel. Whispering. So very light touch where you can still see the layers underneath. And now I'm adding a pale peach. But very shortly I'm going to start changing the way I apply the pastel, and instead of whispering, I'm going to shout. And I'm going to start pressing harder. And with the softer pastels, you're going to really see the difference in those marks. All right. Now I'm gradually getting a little lighter. So I'm adding a little bit of a lighter yellow. Right now, all these flowers are floating on the surface, and we're going to have to make some changes because it doesn't look natural to have everything floating. Also, I'm trying to keep in mind that I want a variety of shapes and sizes and stages of bloom. Some things are going to be in full bloom, and some things are going to be spent already, and some things are not quite bloomed out. I'm adding some grayed down green right now to some of the flowers. Make a few that are not quite open yet. And I'm basically just trying to feel my way through to get some rhythm and movement through the flowers. And I'm going to actually give everything another quick spray of fixative. Let that dry for a minute, and then I'll be right back. All right, with the fixative dry, now I can go back over those fixed areas. And now what you can start to see is a very subtle feeling of texture as the greens go over those darker areas. I'm going to take some of this darker green and add it to the base of some of these flowers. And actually go a little bit darker. And when I'm painting flowers, what I like to do is look at the reference photo just so I can get an idea of the way they grow. What is typical about them? Are they wide? Are they tall and skinny? But I want to get as close as possible to the way a typical flower that I'm painting is growing. I'm adding a few more darker green little marks because I'm building up the complexity of the layers. All right, so we're still working with this soft set of pastels. Now what I'm going to do is start to, what I like to call, turn on the lights and look and see where is it, or where are the lighter areas on these flowers. And I don't want to have the same level of detail on every single bloom, because then they all have equal importance. And when that happens, your viewer is not going to know where you want them to go. And I want to move the viewer's eye around the painting, and I'm going to do that by where I create the most contrast. Of course, we talk about that a lot. I talk about that a lot in my videos and my lessons, but it is one of the key things to help me finish a painting, is to know where I want the viewer's eye to look. So I'm gradually adding lighter and lighter pastel. That was a pale yellow, and I have one that's even lighter than that. Now I'm starting to press a little bit harder. Remember I talked about whisper and shout? So now I'm starting to shout by pressing a little bit harder with the pastel to create a contrast between those harder edged marks and the softer marks behind it or next to it. And I will tell you, at this stage in a painting, it's really important that when you're painting, you step back frequently so that you can judge your progress. A lot of times your painting is finished well before you think it is, but you haven't stepped back enough, because you, especially if you're painting, you've got the music going and you're really into it and you're not really paying attention, you can easily lose track of what should be happening, or lose track of your progress. That has happened to me. I really like this yellow-green feeling that some of these blooms have, so I want to add a little bit of that to them. Now, one thing about the Queen Anne's lace is they're not quite as solid as I have them in this painting, so I need to create a little more, or introduce a little bit more air to them, especially these ones up that are up in this up against the sky. So I'm going to do some negative painting with the blue sky color, right? And I'm just going to introduce some of that sky to break up the flowers just a little bit, because they're a little bit more, or they should be a little bit more airy, but again, we don't want it to look too much like lines. So you might put in, excuse me, put in a little bit and then come back and soften them. All right, now it's time to move on, because we're going to pull out the finishing details. And for this, I'm going to actually move into even softer pastels, and I introduced these to you in the beginning of this video. These are the Sennelier Half Stick Paris collection, and there's some really nice colors in here that are going to be just perfect for adding the finishing touches. And one thing about these pastels is they are soft, a little bit softer than the Terry Ludwig, and so it does not take much pressure at all to create thicker marks. So I'm going to come in, I've got this kind of brownish green that I want to, olivey green that I wanted to introduce, give a little more warmth to our grasses. It's also a really nice yellowy, greenish yellow that I can come in. And now what I'm doing is I'm adding some of those really nice finishing details to each flower, making that lacy look. And I don't have to use very much pressure at all with these super soft pastels to get a nice heavier mark. I'm going to hold my board because I'm pressing so hard. We're jumping around here. Now if I really want to add the bright touch with the light, I'm going in and really pressing super hard, and I get these really nice creamy thick marks, almost like impasto, like if I was painting with paint and putting the paint on thick. Can you see the difference here between these thicker marks and these really fine marks? Oh, I press so hard that my stick breaks, and while that is sad, it's sometimes necessary to really get this effect, especially at the end of a painting. So So I have to kind of roll with that. Try to save it though. All right, what else do I need to do? Well, everything's floating. We talked about how we don't want things to float. So we need to ground them. We need to make a few stems. So I'm going to pull the hard pastels back out. And what I'm going to do is come in with I have a dark blue in here, and I'm going to create some stems. And I don't want them to look like balloons, so I don't want thick, heavy stem action. So what I'm doing is I'm creating broken lines with my marks. And how do you get a broken line? You press. It's going to go through the press and release, press and release, press and release, so that you get a variety in your mark making. And every flower does not have to have a stem, and then there can be stems that don't belong to a flower. So I'm going to come in with a dark green and create a few stems and grasses that don't belong to flowers that are just there. And I'm going to create those broken or dancing linear marks. I'm actually going to pull some in from the side of the painting to help pull your eye into the painting. I have a olive green hard pastel. So I can use these hard pastels to really come in and get some of that foliage and grasses. And what I'm doing, you can tell, is I'm pulling some of that foliage over these flowers so that they are now starting to be hidden. So some are emerging, right? Some are kind of hidden behind the grasses. I'm adding some of these little bits that we see coming off the center of the Queen Anne's lace. Once you start to have a few of these grasses that you've created with the hard pastels, it's time to put them aside and go back to these super soft pastels to get a variety of marks. So if you look at your reference photo, you can see that there's like some thicker grassy, weedy things. So I'm going to come in and really press hard and make some really interesting shouting marks with that dark green. There's some that are kind of growing this way with a brighter green. And yeah, I'm looking at this tangle of wildflowers in my reference photo to give me some ideas. But I'm trying to get a variety of shapes and sizes of my marks. So I've started out, as you can tell, with all those thin marks, and I'm gradually increasing my pressure and the softness of the pastel to get a wider variety of marks, which is going to make these flowers come to life a little bit more. And for the whole, oops, I just broke another one. What happens when you keep breaking your pastels? Well, save your bits. You can reconstitute them if you really need to. But I just keep working with the little bits until they get so small I can't use them anymore. And then of course you can order some open stock if you find that you have some that are your favorites and you really have used them up. Make note of what they are. Now there's also, I'm seeing some of those really nice golden, dried, weedy looking things that I can put into my mix. Make sure you pay attention to the direction that you make your marks. Unless it's a super windy day that you're trying to capture, you don't want them to have going in all the same direction, because that would be boring. Even is boring. So a little more variety is going to be more interesting for your viewer. Now, there's another thing that I would like to do. I'm going to take my lightest light, it's almost white, to make a few of those finishing marks on these flowers. And then one thing that is fun to do is come in with a steel-tipped push pin and just kind of come in and draw around your really thick marks to remove some pastel and get some really interesting marks. And this will only work if you've used thick enough pastel. If the pastel is thick enough, so basically using those softer pastels, then you are really able to dig through and get some kind of interesting texture by drawing into your marks. You can do the same thing for grasses and stems. It's a good way to reveal some of the sky as well. So, one last thing, and then we'll recap. I feel like something tells me that this painting needs a little bit more purple. I always like to say, when in doubt, add some purple. Purple works really well. We've got the triad of the orange, green, and violet, and so it just adds a really nice touch and kind of makes things feel more complete. Let's add a little bit of red violet to add a little bit of light to those purple flowers. And I don't know what they are, but you've all seen fields of wildflowers where there's just such a variety of different colors. There might actually even be a few little yellow things. This is what I love about these super soft Sennelier pastels. They're perfect for these little tiny finishing marks. Look at that wonderful thick mark I can get with them. So just to recap, pastel basics: start with the harder pastels, move on to the softer pastels, and gradually build the complexity of your layers. And by using that light touch for most of the painting and ending with a heavier touch, you can really create the contrast that allows your subject to really pop. So I hope you've enjoyed this demo. I love painting for you. I hope to introduce more YouTube videos, but please do like, subscribe, comment. I really appreciate it. And join us on Patreon for so much more. And thanks for watching.